Testing. 1, 2, 3. Here we go. So, welcome, my friends. Today we are going to be looking a little bit into one of the darker situations in life, and it is drug addiction. Myself, I'm going to talk from an aspect of knowing firsthand, for I've struggled with it, as well as we're going to hear some other people talk about it and some of their stories and what they went through. So, I'm 30 years old and 2 years of my life having addiction, and up until about 2 years ago, it was new, but luckily about 2.5 years ago, I started trying to redeem my soul by giving up addictions one by one. And so it's brought me to a point now where I'm on a pain management protocol, and it helps. It keeps me stable, and that's a repercussion to an infection I ended up with because of my drug use in those hard years. I was always bouncing between being homeless and living on the streets and living in vehicles, living in my mom's friends' vehicles, homeless shelters, living with my mom, having my own place for a little while, in and out of jail, traveling, everything. And it would always seem that every time I'd try to get further away from my family and core supporters, I'd start going downhill really fast into my addictions. And looking back now, I never had to do near the amount of research that I kept telling myself I was going to continue to do. And now I've come to that point where I've made the conscious effort and the choice to say enough's enough, and I want to do something with my life. And I've started focusing on going back to school now and upgrading, starting a YouTube channel. I find now that I have hobbies in my life and starting to focus myself on more positive outlets, that I'm not in that never-ending bad cycle of toxic thinking and having toxic people around me. So for that, I am really glad. And now I've got more money all the time. I've got a continuous home. I've gone out and did adulting, like going out, getting a brand new bed, buying myself a vehicle, paying my bills, because I'm not just worried about trying to get that next fix, trying to fill that void that was always within me. So, with it being like the last 3 months, I've come through all the worst of everything that this horrible life of addiction has been building up against me. And now finally I'm on like this smooth road where it's not feeling like all the bad problems of life that would continuously have me running back to my addiction and trying to lose myself, because I didn't want to face all the small issues. I didn't want to face having to deal with feelings. That's the one that really got me. I couldn't stand having to feel things. And now I know that no matter what, nothing's gonna be too much for me to bear. And once it starts feeling like it's gonna be too much for me to bear, I reach out to my network and to friends and family, and I talk to people. I open up and I start focusing on whatever it is, it feels like it's such a big issue, and I work through it. I don't just try to bury it down inside of me and lock it away and act like as if it's not real or something, because unfortunately it is, and it can really be detrimentally bad to my health, especially if I do not stay on top of venting and reaching out for help, because that's been my biggest challenge throughout my life, was always not being able to reach out for help and feel like I was too proud to have to say I need help. I could do it on my own. Because when I first came into becoming an adult, I, from the time of 14, lived on the streets and had to go out and get my own. And I went to every level, from beg, borrowing, and stealing, right up to actually having a job to pay for it. And looking back now, it's insane how much of my life I've wasted, and I'll never get that time back. I could have so much more stuff in my life already worked out and straightened out if I would have worked on these problems starting at a much younger age, instead of continuously just running and then doing all the unhealthy choices of letting it all spiral out of control by not having a positive outlook and not wanting to reach out to the right people, and instead just surrounding myself with other addicts and people that were without a care in their life, because I thought those were the cool people. Like, I thought they had everything they wanted and they were doing so good. They could do drugs whenever they wanted, they could drink whenever they wanted, they could smoke cigarettes, they could go out and do coke or smoke weed. To me, I thought that was the life. And if I would have had it, even an ounce of the wisdom that I've got now, looking back on it, it's all such a bad idea to try and think that there's something there worth loving in that hardcore life of just being a strung out drug addict, or even like a good for nothing dope dealer who has like no life whatsoever and is out spying on people and putting cameras on them to try and get up any kind of dirt as possible, right? Anything to try and make a buck. Tell whatever lies that have to be told so that people wouldn't look at me like I'm the total clown that must be, because I'm wanting to put cameras in to their house to spy on them from every which angle. But it's psych them all out, making them think it's all about something else when it's my own sick, twisted ways. And I mean, I had no inkling of an idea that all those things would all come back to bite me in the ass and would start making me live this completely unhealthy lifestyle that I just continuously had nothing to show for myself ever. And I mean, like, even now, I've got my own vehicle, I got a plow, I'm able to help take care of my mom who's up there in age now. I pay my bills, I've got my own toys, and the biggest thing is I've got self-esteem again. I've got modesty. I actually have self-worth. And the whole time I was lost in my addiction, I had a diluted belief, maybe, that I had some kind of core values that made me worthwhile, but it was all just an elaborate lie that I was believing. And even though now, all that stuff I've been through, I try to hold it close so that I won't forget about it and I won't let it all happen again. Because if I do try to forget about what I'd gone through and what had happened, then it probably will happen again. That cycle will start all over again. If I forget where taking that very first drink or that first hit or that first smoke, using that first rush, where it's going to end up, because it's always going to take you to that same spot, that dead end, no future, lucky to be alive lifestyle, where there's just not even a feeling of why you have to be alive, like no purpose to be alive, because all that's on your forefront is just to score again. And this is why it is so important for us to try and focus on our youth, so that while they're young, to try and break down those barriers, that they won't try to isolate themselves if they're sent off to foster care or if they're sent into group homes like I was, and they lose that whole connection of family. And it's like when you don't have that connection to family and you have to start building it with strangers, you get a whole different moral compass to you. And that's the kind of stuff that will totally determine who you're going to become later in life. And had I tried to break through those spells of being suicidal because I was stuck in the group homes because my parents didn't want me, couldn't handle me because I was so rebellious, acting up, drinking, everything by the time I was like 13, 14, coming off the res. I hopefully will have helped somebody with this message. Maybe I'll do a follow up to this one too. But now let's get into some other videos too. Here we go.
Available at the time was many medicinals. And most of the users at that time were older people. Middle-aged women, in fact, were the main users of heroin. There were two other groups of heroin users in the latter part of the 19th century. One is a group we call the opium eaters. And these mainly were sort of the yuppies of the time. These were the people interested in the arts. And although it was frowned upon, people didn't pay too much attention to this. However, at the same time, we had people in the West Coast who were smoking opium. And a lot of people were very upset about this because the people smoking opium weren't the upper class. They were Chinese workers. And the first punitive laws in this country against the use of drugs was against the Chinese in San Francisco in the 19th century. Now, at the same time that all this was happening, Freud had discovered cocaine.
Freud made a serious mistake. He thought cocaine was a new wonder drug which could cure his patients of their addiction to heroin. Since then, whole societies have made the same kind of mistake.
During the 30s and early 40s, amphetamine was extensively used. During World War II, pilots, air crew members used amphetamine on long missions.
It was only after the war that amphetamines became a serious problem.
In the late 40s, I was a student, a graduate student at the University of Kentucky, and I obtained a position at the Addiction Research Center. Actually, it was the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, which was a prison hospital for the treatment of opiate use, or any drug that was against the law based on the Harrison Narcotic Act.
Kornetsky and his colleagues carefully recorded the effects of different drugs.
When opiates are abruptly withdrawn after chronic administration, an abstinence or withdrawal syndrome emerges, indicating the development of physical dependence. He yawns and is restless, complains of aches and pains, and exhibits fever, goose flesh, excessive sweating, and vomiting. The twitching in the legs has given rise to the expression kicking the habit.
Amphetamines, too, had bizarre effects.
Which most of us addicts would be calling Jimmy legs. As soon as you start going through those withdrawals from the hardcore opiates, you get those twitches so bad for anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks, where they're just restless, your nerves are all going wild, and just pain through every joint, every muscle in your body just aches. Yeah, hot and cold flashes. It is so uncomfortable to be in your own skin. You're continuously sitting in the tub to try and draw it out, trying to have showers, trying to get Tylenol and ibuprofen just to take off the severe headaches and migraines that kick in because you start getting so dehydrated because you've got continuous diarrhea. It's the worst having that kind of diarrhea, and you can't even hold anything down. And it doesn't matter if it's heroin or um, pills like morphine, dillies, hydromorphs, oxycontin, methadone.
In this scene, the subject is chasing a non-existent butterfly through the air and catching it and handing it to the examiner. He then plucks insects from the skin of his arm.
But the psychotherapy available at the time failed to help these addicted patients.
Well, I became concerned by the fact that it didn't seem like we were doing very much for these people. And I became aware that maybe we were not looking at the proper measure. We really should be looking at why are these drugs reinforcing, why are they rewarding, why do they produce pleasurable effects? Well, about that time in the early 50s, Heath in Louisiana reported some interesting studies in man suggesting that there might be some sort of pleasure area in the brain.
You almost look like you're smiling a bit. Are you?
Oh, no, I might.
Heath implanted electrodes in the brains of chronically depressed patients, hoping to stimulate pleasurable sensations.
I guess I've cracked up all the way. I don't know.
I mean, that's the reason you're smiling.
Probably.
Well, you look like you're really... What are you laughing
I
about?
don't know.
Huh?
Were you doing something to me?
Not surprisingly, the experiments were controversial, but the electrodes did have an effect, especially near an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. Heath even let his patients control their own stimulation.
I find this button the best.
That's number 2 button.
Most pleasurable.
How do you feel?
I made a small joke yesterday. I don't know if I should repeat it or not.
I'd like to hear it.
Do you think it's worth repeating? What about the very deep, deep electrode all the way down?
You're trying to tell me how it excites you, is that it?
Oh, I think it's somewhat of a sexy button.
Oh. Is that why you said it went all the way down?
Perhaps we get pleasure from drugs because they stimulate the same brain areas as sex and food. Working in Montreal in the 1950s, James Olds devised a crucial test. He worked out a new way to, in effect, ask animals how they felt.
This is a device which trains the animal to turn on the stimulus for himself. Here you notice the animal wandering toward the pedal. When he first touches it, he gets no stimulation. It's not connected yet. Then one time he touches the pedal, it does turn on the stimulation. You can see the lights go on.
Now, the interesting thing about the old stimulation, the rewarding stimulation, was the strength of it. It was somewhat different than rewarding stimulation for food and water in that there was no satiation. Animals would continue for hours and hours and didn't seem to satiate. They didn't feel full. They would just keep doing it for long, long periods of time. They would do it to exhaustion.
Now, I will electrify the grid. The animal must cross an area that gives a very painful shock to the feet in order to get to the pedal and stimulate the brain.
And a rat wanting brain stimulation would brave a shock stronger than even a starving rat would brave to get food.
This shows a rat is willing to pay a very high price in order to get to the pedal.
Human addicts will pay just as high a price for their rewards.
Everything is about getting high, and any means necessary to get there becomes rational. If it means stealing something from somebody close to you, then you'll do that. If it means lying to your family, borrowing money from people you know you can't pay back, writing checks you know you can't cover, you do all of those things. And if you're sitting around a table freebasing, it's 5 people freebasing, one of them falls out on the floor and dies, you don't call for help because that's more cocaine for the rest of it.
In the laboratory, which drugs would cause an animal to pay that kind of price?
The fascinating thing was that we found in our laboratory that every single drug that increased sensitivity of the animal to brain stimulation was either an abuse substance or a substance that has potential for abuse.
So James Olds' technique of the 50s gave scientists a way of testing for the addictive potential of drugs. And a way to find out where in the brain they acted.
Now, I think there's general agreement that this is the area where the action is in terms of the rewarding effects of drugs. Whether they be heroin, whether they be amphetamine, whether they be cocaine or angel dust or whatever, any drug that produces rewarding effects, it's believed this is where the action is.
Using similar methods, Chris Fibiger and his colleagues in Vancouver wanted to know which pleasure areas are active when we crave both drugs and food. They found that the area Heath stimulated in his patients, the nucleus accumbens, is the center of a key network, the dopamine circuit. Heroin seems to act in one way. Cocaine in another. And both hit the nucleus accumbens, which the Canadian scientists recently proved is also active when we crave food.
If we selectively take these dopamine neurons out of that part of the brain, the animal loses interest in self-administered
fucking stalkers, eh?
There's apparently the drug is no longer reinforcing. The same story seems to apply for amphetamine. If you destroy these dopamine-containing neurons in the nucleus accumbens, amphetamine self-administration disappears as well. I think that this approach is going to be able to tell us something about how the human mind works, in the sense that what is it that causes feelings of pleasure, feelings of sadness, depression, euphoria. All of these things are processes that take place probably involving these reward circuits that we're looking at.
The use of these drugs will often lead to compulsive use. And compulsive use is not certainly limited just to drugs. We have people who compulsively eat, people who are involved in compulsive sex, and this certainly is not normal behavior. Interesting thing about these drugs is that they can produce a compulsive use very easily. They're so rewarding, so reinforcing, that pretty soon all types of behavior are excluded. The person really reverts back to almost a very primitive type of animal.
A heroin addict has volunteered to be given a large dose of morphine, chemically similar to heroin, by scientists at the National Institute for Drug Abuse in Baltimore.
Yeah, they seem to try and act like this pill's gonna work for every James, Dick, and Harry. Odds are it's not gonna work for every single person. Same with how they try to use like methadone or Suboxone right now. Half the people that are out there, it doesn't work for. It works for select handfuls of people. Yeah, it's like a miracle drug for them. Hey, I'm case in point right here. But what kind of psychological factors are going to come with trying to take a pill to make these problems all go away when it's more deep than just, oh, I'm going to take it for the reward factor of it. It's a way of living and functioning when you have to bury stuff and subdue a part of your being. That's where it all originates from. I don't think a pill is going to be the right answer to dealing with that, what you call, epidemic of drug addiction.
Today, using new methods, researchers can at last start to look at where drugs act in the human brain. The new machines reveal why different drugs make us act like primitive animals. Morphine shuts down the higher cortex and leaves the older emotional brain in charge. Cocaine gives a boost to the whole brain, but especially stimulates the primitive centers of emotion. So from those rough and ready experiments in the 1950s, scientists did learn where in the brain many addictive drugs act.
Surgeons drill into man's skull to treat meth addiction. Doctors in China are using brain implants in an attempt to treat a man's drug addiction. This technique is controversial and has struggled to recruit willing participants elsewhere in the world. According to the Associated Press, Chinese surgeons are using deep brain stimulation, or DBS, to treat methamphetamine addiction in its first ever clinical trial. The technique involves a device being surgically implanted onto the brain. This would stimulate targeted areas of the brain in an attempt to stop drug addiction. The surgeon drilled 2 holes through the patient's skull and placed 2 electrodes at the nucleus accumbens. This part of the brain is believed to be connected with addiction. Next, the man had a battery pack implanted on his chest to power the brain device. After 2 days, the doctor switched on the DBS devices to activate the electrodes. According to the Associated Press, there are risks to the surgery. These include seizures, infection, or potential death via brain hemorrhage. Critics believe that human experiments like this are at a premature stage and don't address biological, social, and psychological factors that cause a person to become addicted in the first place. The Associated Press reports there is also concern around issues regarding participants' informed consent in places such as China. Speaking to the Associated Press, investigators from similar US-based studies explained their attempts at trials for treating alcoholism were stopped. This was because study design and preliminary results didn't justify the risk.
Jada Pinkett Smith seems to have the perfect life, a successful career and a beautiful family. But apparently, it wasn't always like that. The has opened up to her Facebook fans about troubles in her past. The day after her birthday, Jada typed out a special message reflecting on her past. "I had many addictions of several kinds to deal with my life issues," she said. Although it's not exactly clear what kind of addiction she's talking about, we're glad Jada has moved on. "Today, at 42, I have my wisdom, my heart, and my conscience as the only tools to overcome life's inevitable obstacles," she said. Reflecting on life is a common thing to do when birthdays roll around, and it seems Jada wanted to share some things she learned with others. "What I hope is that we all continue to gain healthy understanding that life is really about solving problems, and also about us learning to become masters at solving them." Wise words from a wise woman.
There are different types of receptors in the brain that are triggered by particular substances. A case in point is there are opiate receptors in the brain. And for instance, when a person gets a runner's high, and the endorphins are sort of kicked into the body, the body responds in a very similar way as if they were ingesting opiates. That's one reason why they're very popular. But although they may trigger some of the same receptors, one is an internally generated substance and one is an externally generated substance, albeit maybe initially a natural substance, but it's going to be having a different effect, even though it may be affecting some of the same areas of the brain. And there's also, with most of these manufactured substances, the possibility of them being diluted or mixed with other substances that the body would not in any way be able to handle. Basically, you are getting drunk on your own internal chemistry. And we experience this all the time. When we have this pleasurable experience, whether it's, well, look at the response. A good example is when you cry. There may be all of this pain that you're going through. There's all of these stories you're telling yourselves. There's these painful images that you're playing through your mind. There's the feelings of, desperation or aloneness or loss. And then you will cry, and I mean a big sobbing cry. And then at a certain point you stop and you feel better. Well, your brain has responded to those intense emotions by releasing substances in the brain which are going to allow you to cope, are going to allow you to have this pleasurable experience, and you can go on living. You're not going to be lost in that grief forever.
Do you have addictions? Well, often an addiction is hiding something. I remember when I first saw a therapist many years ago, and the first thing he said to me, he said, "So what do you excel in?" And I said, "Nothing." And he looked really bewildered. And I said, "I'm too busy to excel in everything." Then he goes, "Oh, okay." So what he was looking for was to see, where do I put all my energy and my focus so that I'm not facing the real problem. And when I said I'm too busy, it just meant that I was putting my energy and focus everywhere so as not to really come back and focus on my problem. And people will often put that in drinking or drugs or in obsessive relationships. They'll try and divert or numb out their emotions by having addictions. So if you are brave enough and you decide that you want to change what you're addicted to because it has power over you and you are not in control, then before you have that drink or before you go to call that person, you might be codependent person, always needy and always need help, sit in that moment and say, what is it that I'm really feeling? What is it inside me that's really hurting? What is it that I really fear? And then connect with that. And if you can, you'll begin to heal these addictions of even food or drink, whatever it is, heal yourself and be in control of your life. And it is a journey, it is a process. But if you can do that, then you will feel proud, you'll feel powerful, and you will be able to go forward in a much happier way and healthier way, because addictions, well, the negative addictions aren't healthy. So I challenge you to begin. And is it coffee? Mine was coffee. That's all I had left. Because I don't drink and I don't really, I don't do any of that. But I did like a cup of coffee. And it's a negative addiction. And I like to be calm. And so I started to look at it and I started to say, what is it it's doing for me? And then it's slowly faded away, and I look at it as a toxic, something toxic. So I'm saying to myself, do I want to drink toxin? And I say no now, so it's no longer an addiction. So find out what yours are and improve your life.
Do you think his problem is canonicity? No. I mean, I was stopped at lunch today when asked basically the same question. A guy had been teaching our material, and he said, there's always one in there that doesn't get it. You know, and the objection is always some theological question. Or I don't agree on this theological point, or I'm a Calvinist, or something like that. And I said, it's not the issue. You know, I almost can tell you 100% it's not the issue. I could talk to this guy all night long about canonicity, would not resolve his problem. Now, I knew that, and so how do you get off of that as quick as I could? And so I just started asking him his story. You know, tell me about your background, your family, whatever else. And what I heard was no bonding. And so I brought that out. I said, let me tell you what happens. When somebody in their human relationship like that have no bonding, and they do come to Christ, what happens? What's their relationship with God like? It's just all intellectual. And of course, that's not satisfying. And so what happens when you get married? Well, he's on his second marriage, and that one's starting to fail. And I said, so I got his attention, and I said, well, what do you mean by bonding? I said, well, you know, we have an opportunity, you know, as new creations to be new creations in Christ, to bond with God. And the one who supposedly wasn't backslidden looked at his watch and said, it's getting late. I think we need to go to bed. And I said, see, that's what you do. As soon as we get too close to you, you're looking for a way out. He smiled and left. And the other guy was so sobered by this that he knew exactly what I was talking about. I mean, and didn't run. He said, I could walk out of here too. He said, but I know what's going to happen. I'll just walk away from my marriage, whatever else. And it was getting late, and I had to speak the next day. And he said, what do you do? And I at that time, to be honest with you, I just said, here, you don't need me. You need God at this stage of the game. I want you to just sit down and go through that. I gave him steps to freedom. But there is a case where I'm petitioning God. Me, personally, I'm petitioning God. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't even have high expectations, to be honest with you. But when I showed up in the morning, there he was with a guitar hanging around his shoulder. He used to lead music in church, all red-eyed. And I said, he asked me, he said, could I sing this morning? I said, I don't know, can you? And the Spirit at that time said, you know, go ahead and let him. Well, I had a little ministry that weekend. That guy had a real ministry. And he shared in his own heart. And but he bonded with God. I mean, I really believe in my heart he did. And he did. He told me that. He said that was the first time as a Christian that he felt he had an Abba-Father relationship. And you know, it just helped him come to terms and repentance. Now, getting back to what we're talking about here, what is repentance? It's change of mind. Why are we stuck? Well, we come into this world, we have neither the presence of God in our life nor the knowledge of God's ways. And so we learn to live our life independent of God. We all did. Now, you can have some very good human relationships and experience. You can have a loving mom and dad. You can get close to them. I think one of the real tragedies we went through in the 60s and 70s was substituting the mother's breast with formula. It did, however, give rise to the need for throwaway diapers. If you've ever raised a child who had formula, let me tell you, that's enough said. Anyway, But it wasn't just that the mother's milk had some antibiotics and stuff like that. There are things that the child would need. I think there was a closeness there and a bonding that was intended to take place that we've walked away from. And I think that's very tragic in our experience. But I've just seen this a number of times. I've just seen students at our seminary come. They've never had that relationship. Let me tell you, the relational connection. The most artificial thing you have is a seminary experience. I mean, I come to know that. I happen to have a doctorate in education. Most of it's educational psych as well. And I realized at that time that the very thing that I was teaching I couldn't model, just like you've done for 2 days. And you know it. I mean, he knows it. But, he wants it on tape, so you go home and listen to it and absorb it. We both sell a lot of tapes that way. You talk so fast. I sell a lot of tapes that way. And, but
it's in the contract with ICBC, I think.
But see, here's the issue. People